And so tell us from your perspective, Sebastian, why you think, going back into history as well, why has capital and how has capital become such a powerful force in our world?
I think the big shift came with the Industrial Revolution, actually, because once you had electricity, steam, rail, and so forth, it suddenly made sense to produce goods on a large scale. I mean, before around 1840, the standard unit of the American economy was the one-man shop, because you couldn't bring in inputs from a long way away, you couldn't sell at a long distance, you couldn't have mechanization, so there was no sort of economies of scale from spreading those capital expenditures over a bigger operation.
Yeah.
So that was the time of essentially small companies and therefore small finance. Once you get big companies, and particularly the revolution of allowing joint stock companies, then you need shareholders, you need bigger debt markets, and finance becomes very important. You see JP Morgan, the man, not the bank, emerging around the turn of the century, around 1900, as one of the most powerful figures in the United States, and I think that's the moment when finance really emerges.
And one can argue, maybe if you go back even further, Sebastian, as I've tried to go in my book as well, if you go back into what I call the great trading game, or the great trading era that we see, where global trade becomes possible, right, through better oceanic navigational technologies, etc. Of course, you hear stories of colorful characters like the Medicis, right, and powerful bankers that fund trade, right, global trade. Was that also maybe the early starting points of the power of capital that then builds into maybe what you've rightly mentioned as the era when it suddenly scales up, the need for capital and the power for capital?
Yes, I agree. And I'd say that the common theme here is that technology often drives these changes. So as you said, oceanic navigation, when that becomes technologically doable, then you need finance to sort of pay for it. And trading over larger geographies also required trade finance. So you're right. My choice was highlighting a different kind of emergence, the sort of company finance, as opposed to trade finance or project finance. But clearly, any historical story is going to be subtle. There's going to be multiple watersheds along the road.
Yeah, and layers, of course. And of course, you've written about capital from various perspectives, but tell us maybe some characters, like you obviously just mentioned JP Morgan. I was mentioning the Medicis from many centuries ago. But tell us about some of the colorful or characters that you've come across in your research that maybe in some ways exemplify the power capital has exerted on our world.
Well, I'll pick one from the hedge fund world and one from the venture capital world. So
Sure.
From the hedge fund world, I think the story of George Soros, the first really powerful global macro trader, kind of exemplifies the power of capital. He forced the devaluation of the British currency famously in 1992, and then he was at the center of the later devaluations in Southeast Asia, which began with Thailand in 1997. So you have there an individual, operating out of a smallish office near Central Park in New York with duct tape on the floor, and he looks like a small operation, but actually governments are quaking before him. And then from the venture capital world, I think I would choose Arthur Rock, who, as I describe at the beginning of my book, The Power Law, is the figure who goes out to the West Coast and does the first proper venture capital deals on the West Coast. And because of the success of that formula of risk capital for technology, he starts something which ends up creating both sort of Silicon Valley and, broader than that, just the most successful innovation hub that we've seen in history. And I think that was down to the nature of Arthur Rock's financial innovations and how influential they were.